Another warning from the Met Office, early warning of heavy rain this weekend. But for the time being, it's cool and showery today. Very cool, in fact, across Scotland. Temperatures below the average. And some of the showers that do brew this afternoon will be falling as sleet, even snow across the mountains of Scotland. And in the northeast, quite heavy with some cracks of thunder too. But any showers today that do brew will be very scattered around. So there's going to be some dry weather too. Temperatures of around about 18 degrees Celsius in London. Feeling very cool, especially on the coast itself, in the breeze coming in from the north or the northwest. And as I say, the showers brewing through the afternoon pretty much anywhere across the country, but some of us escaping them and seeing some dry weather. We'll end the afternoon on a cool note across Northern Ireland, and tonight will be a very chilly night, a touch of ground frost across the Highlands of Scotland. Even in London, temperatures down to single figures. Now, tomorrow morning we start off mostly sunny across central England, but rain gathers in the southwest and the west of Scotland. But it's Saturday, the day that we're worried about, possibly 1 inch or 2 inches of rain on the way. Sophie.
Thomas, thank you very much. And that's it from me for now. Let's go back to Hugh now in Downing Street. Hugh.
Sophie, thank you very much. Yes, welcome once again to Downing Street. We are in that process of handover. Tony Blair has left Downing Street. He's gone to Buckingham Palace, where he is seeing the Queen, and his car there just stopped outside the main King's Steps within the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. And over at the Treasury building is the Chancellor. Not the Chancellor for much longer. Gordon Brown waiting to leave the Treasury for the last time as Chancellor and to accept an invitation from the Queen to form a government. And an invitation, of course, that he will accept. He's got the parliamentary muscle to do that, and he is the new Labour leader. That is the process, and that's the way things are likely to happen. It's interesting, of course, to dwell today on the fact that Gordon Brown is Britain's longest-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he is replacing a Prime Minister who is one of the longest-serving, certainly on record, Tony Blair, having completed more than 10 years in office. We're going to talk to some of our experts now. I'm joined here in Downing Street by our political editor, Nick Robinson, and our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell, is at Buckingham Palace. Also at Westminster is the constitutional expert, Professor David Cannadine. So we'll talk to our three guests as we wait for Mr. Blair to leave the palace and as we wait for that invitation to be extended to Gordon Brown at the Treasury. Nick, at this moment in time, I'm assuming the resignation has been accepted, so we're in that little gap, aren't we?
A gap with no Prime Minister. And if you think that's unusual and odd that no one is in control of the country, in times past it often lasted for a matter of days. When Lloyd George resigned, it was 4 days before Bonar Law took over. We were without a Prime Minister, and when Churchill did it, it was a day before Eden. Now, just a matter of minutes. I'm told that there is more than one finger on the nuclear trigger, so were such a thing, God help us, to be necessary, there is someone else in charge, although of course Gordon Brown could be rushed round to the palace mightily quickly to make him the new Prime Minister.
Now, once Mr. Blair leaves, all those trappings, all that support system that he's been used to for a decade will, most of it anyway, will fall away.
And much of it already has. You described the car there, we see it there. It's no longer his car. It was his car until he stepped into Buckingham Palace. It is now the Prime Minister's car, and he is no longer the Prime Minister. He will have to get into another car. Now, not so long ago, when Ted Heath gave his resignation, he came out from seeing Her Majesty to discover there was no car. Nobody had thought what he'd do. The car, nicknamed Pegasus for security reasons, had actually shot back to Downing Street to pick up Harold Wilson, and they had to phone up and say, has anybody got a car in the government pool in order to bring him back? Mr. Blair, because of security these days, of course, has protection and cars and police officers, but it still will be a different one, and he won't have access to the magical Downing Street switchboard, which allows him to be put through on the phone to anybody he likes round the world just by saying, get me Hugh Edwards, get me the President of the United States. He'll have to dial for himself.
Looking at the Treasury, Nick, and all the staff they're lining up who've been used, of course, to this decade of power under Gordon Brown. A few thoughts, maybe? What is Gordon Brown thinking right now?
I think he'll be thinking, my God, I've actually got it. When we talk of the achievements, as you did, of being the longest-serving Chancellor, he is also the longest-serving ever next Prime Minister. They come and go, don't they? We say Ken Clarke's about to be the next Tory, or Dennis Healey years ago, or Rab Butler for the Tories. They never did, though, because actually it's very hard to stay the apprentice for that long. You're almost always removed. Gordon Brown's remarkable political achievement, at some cost to himself and his reputation, has been to fight, to hang on, to say, it will be my turn, I will do it. And I think he will ponder on that. And having spent some time with him in his constituency recently and in his father's church in Kirkcaldy, I don't think it is spin to suggest he will be thinking of his father. When I asked him about it, tears come into Gordon Brown's eyes when you mention his father. The sense of duty, of service, of having to live up to what his father believed in is very, very important to him.
Nick, thank you. Well, we're still waiting for Mr. Blair to leave Buckingham Palace, and we're waiting, of course, for Mr. Brown to appear at the Treasury. Let's stay with these pictures and talk to one of our other guests, Professor David Cannadine, who's in another part of Westminster. Professor Cannadine, thank you very much for joining us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Hugh.
What are your thoughts on this process of handover?
Well, my thoughts, I suppose, are that it's a very orderly process of handover as well as being a very rapid one. And in a curious sort of way, that's an interesting epitaph on the joint Blair-Brown years. We're often told that they've had a troubled and stormy partnership in number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. But in fact, it's been the most successful collaboration ever between a Prime Minister and a Chancellor in terms of how the economy's done and in terms of how the Labour Party has done. And that's often not stressed, which I think it ought to be. And the orderly transfer of power from one to the other now, as Blair retires as Prime Minister and as Brown succeeds him, is in a sense all of a piece with that story, which, as I say, is often not the story we're told, but is, I think, in many ways the most important story of the joint Blair-Brown years.
What do you expect Mr. Brown to be up to in the first few hours in Downing Street?
Well, he will be forming his cabinet, which is what Prime Ministers always do in their first few hours in Downing Street. That's the point, rather like choosing a menu in a restaurant when all the options are open, but once you've chosen the meal you want, you can't have the other meals you might have liked. And by the same token, he'll have huge freedom of manoeuvre during the first few hours in office. But once senior posts are filled, then of course his options will get less. But the process of cabinet making is always one of the most exciting and enjoyable aspects of being Prime Minister, and of course, and by definition, of being a new Prime Minister.
I was rather cheekily making the assumption that Mr. Brown probably knows and has known for some time, Professor Cannadine, maybe who's in that cabinet. Would you agree with that?
Well, we will have to talk to him about that. I'm sure he has got some ideas already worked out. Nevertheless, there's a difference between putting your cabinet on the back of an envelope and actually appointing the people for real. And so we are now into reality rather than hypotheticals. And I should have thought he will find reality rather exhilarating.
Professor Cannadine, thank you very much for joining us. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Over to the Treasury. Our correspondent Carol Walker is there. Carol, what are the signs?
Well, everyone is now just waiting for Gordon Brown to head off for the palace. He's had this hour or so since he returned from Prime Minister's questions, and another hour or so of waiting to be summoned to the palace. I'm told that during that time he occupied himself by signing off some Treasury papers and indeed looking through some briefings for some of the conversations he's going to be having later this evening with other world leaders. He, of course, by that time will be the British Prime Minister. We know that Tony Blair has had his audience with the Queen. He'll have been waiting now for the phone call from Robin Janvrin at Buckingham Palace to the Principal Private Secretary James Bowler here at the Treasury. That will be the moment when Gordon Brown will formally be summoned to Buckingham Palace to be invited by the Queen. Of course, there have also been quite a few farewells to go through here at the Treasury. As we've been hearing, he's had this extraordinary record, 10 years here. Many of the staff he's been working with have been here throughout that decade. So there have been some tributes, there have been some farewells, there has been a chance for him to thank the staff who've been alongside him for so long. But of course, Gordon Brown, being the man that he is, will be impatient to be getting on with it. You could see him there during Prime Minister's question, almost twitching with the anticipation. The last Prime Minister's questions, of course, when he'll have been sitting down on that front bench listening to Tony Blair. Next week, he will be the one standing there at the dispatch box answering those questions. Here at the Treasury, they've been waiting. We can see the staff lined up to wish him a farewell. He'll be leaving from here in his official Treasury car. It's here with the engine running outside, ready to whisk him off to the Buckingham Palace. He'll be leaving, of course, as Prime Minister.
Carol, thank you. Straight over to Buckingham Palace and our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
Well, 23 minutes he's been in there, Hughes, so far, and you probably saw just the pictures a moment ago. An equerry came out with what appeared to be a box which went into the boot of the car. Now, the car hasn't actually been changed over. I think that they must have done it earlier. It is the same vehicle that he arrived in that he will be leaving in. That perhaps a measure of the need for the security that will surround Mr. Blair. But I don't know that it is a prime ministerial car. It doesn't seem to have quite so many bits and pieces on it now. As we will see him in a moment, as an ex-Prime Minister, he doesn't quite need all the communications equipment. But I think that there we are. We see Mr. and Mrs. Blair now emerging from the King's Door of Buckingham Palace, having Mr. Blair having submitted his resignation to the Queen and it having been accepted. And they wave as they make their way now into their future lives after 10 years in number 10 Downing Street. And an equerry and a few others just waving them off as the vehicle picks up speed and makes its way out of the quadrangle of Buckingham Palace. And Mr. Anthony Blair gives a wave to us, the media here, crouched in a corner, as the car goes through that central, or that side archway, I should say, and makes its way across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace and out through the main gates. And what lies in store now for this man? Well, who can say? What we do know, of course, is that only a matter of minutes will now pass before we see the next man, Gordon Brown, making his way here to Buckingham Palace, to his audience with the Queen and to that invitation from the Queen to form a government.
Nick, thank you very much. As you say, that telephone call probably being made right now from the Queen's Private Secretary, Sir Robin Janvrin, to the private office of the Chancellor of the Exchequer over at the Treasury. Mr. Blair, his final audience with the Queen complete. He must have had, well, let's do the sums, around 500 of them during his decade in office. But that's his last as Prime Minister. And now the process moves into another kind of gear, because the phone call is probably being made. Mr. Brown will be now getting ready to leave. Nick Robinson, our political editor, still with me. At this stage, Nick, I suppose the palace knows precisely what the Queen is going to be talking to Mr. Brown about after having invited him to form a government.
That's right, because while there are the formalities that she invites him to do it, she also wants a briefing. She wants to know from her new Prime Minister what he has in mind. Remember that although she behaves as a constitutional monarchy who doesn't interfere, she does believe Her Majesty in keeping herself well informed. She may wish to know what his policy priorities are, what plans he has for his cabinet, and to build a relationship. They don't know each other well, and there'll be an opportunity too to usher in Mrs. Brown, Sarah, for a more social occasion at the end. And that's why the timing's on today, quite unpredictable. We don't know how long those conversations precisely will last. What is intriguing to see, the image we're now seeing, though, is it's plain old Mr. Blair again. If we were in the United States, he'd still be the president. President Blair. He loses his title, he's plain old Mr. Blair. It is over for him, politically.
So Mr. Blair and his wife in that cavalcade, crossing Trafalgar Square, Downing Street, the Mall, Buckingham Palace behind them, and they're off, we understand, to County Durham, to Mr. Blair's constituency. There'll be more of that later on. All eyes are now on the Treasury. We're all expecting Mr. Brown, the Chancellor, to appear in a few seconds' time. And Nick, it's interesting that when we talked about the composition, the likely composition of the cabinet, you were disagreeing with the notion that he'll know exactly who's in what job already.
Well, I'm told that he's been up late last night. He was up late the night before with what was described to me by a close assistant of his as three-dimensional chess. You put one person in a job and you think, oh, that's a problem, because your aim is not just the right people in the right jobs. Have you enough women? Have you enough young people in? He wants to lower the average age to deal with the Tories' complaint. Have you enough Blairites in? Have you reached out? And then suddenly a problem occurs. You say, if I've done that, I've left a problem here. And I am told that the cabinet is far from over even now, Hugh, and that after he arrives here, first will come the international calls, the calls to the President of the United States and France and others to say hello as the new Prime Minister, as well as, of course, a greeting from the Cabinet Secretary and others. Then the real business of saying to the Cabinet Secretary, who he's had dialogue with for some weeks, now I've been thinking this is actually what I want to do. And it's a last chance for the civil service machine to say, Have you thought of this? That might be a problem. Anyone who thinks cabinet reshuffles are elegant, look at Tony Blair's. Each and every one has gone wrong, not just for personnel reasons, he's found it hard to sack and hire people, but also for machinery of government reasons. Forgot to have a Scottish office at one stage in a reshuffle until someone said, might help if we did have one, Prime Minister.
Are we looking at more than 6 or 7 changes in this cabinet, Nick, do you think? We're going to look at a very, very new-looking cabinet.
New and different are the phrases that he uses in private about this. But his big decision, of course, is it's no use getting the political credit for new if in weeks you are being attacked for having inexperienced ministers who drop the ball.
Chancellor emerges from the Treasury, shake hands with all the staff who've gathered there, those who've been working with him, some of them for 10 years, since May 1997. There with his wife, as they acknowledge all the applause. This is Britain's new Prime Minister. He's not formally in the job yet, of course, but within the next half hour or so, he will be Britain's new Prime Minister, the 53rd who will have served here in Downing Street. And of course, the man who's been looking at the job, whose ambition it's been to take the job for at least 13 years, but I suspect, Nick, that he's had the ambition for rather longer than that.
Yes, although when we dared to suggest that to him on a News 24 special the other day, he ticked us off and grinned and said, I've not had this ambition forever. After he became an MP, he was happy to say, rather than since birth, which is what many of us had assumed. Yes, he's wanted this job. He's always wanted it. And remember here, when you look at this man, he's been in the public eye since a toddler. He was the son of the church minister, looked at, stared at to see if he'd live up to what his father wants. He was promoted through school so fast he started secondary school at 10, university at 16. Not content with that, he becomes the student rector at 24.
Very warm applause for Gordon Brown as he leaves the Treasury as Chancellor of the Exchequer for the last time. We can discuss maybe a little later on who might replace him there, and the fact that lots of people have been saying they wouldn't envy the person who's going to take over the Treasury with Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, because he'll have a very, very close interest in what goes on. But lots of warm applause, and I think it's fair to say, Nick, that despite all the talk about control freakery and centralising in terms of his attitudes to government, there's a lot of warmth for him in the Treasury and a lot of respect for his ability.
Both of those things, because he's made the Treasury matter. He's made it the single most important thing. So as he waves goodbye there to the staff lined up, they know they're waving goodbye to an era in which the Treasury mattered more than anywhere else at all. And he has respected people who've challenged him. He's had arguments with them, of course, and is now surrounded by people, almost all of whom were recruited during the Brown years. And quietly, Hugh, while this is happening, Treasury officials are lining up, coming in behind us. We're not seeing them, but they're coming, we know, to take key jobs here at number 10. That's how important the Treasury's been to him.
Remarkable scenes at the Treasury as Gordon Brown prepares to leave. The telephone call has obviously been made. He's been summoned by Her Majesty the Queen to an audience at Buckingham Palace where Her Majesty will ask Mr. Brown if he is in a position to form a government. That's the question that they ask. The Queen summons the man or woman most likely to be able to command majority support in the House of Commons. And as the new Labour leader since the weekend, Mr. Brown is clearly that man. And he will accept. And once he's accepted, they'll have a chat about their priorities. He'll come back here to Downing Street where we expect him to say a few words. Carol Walker at the Treasury, what does it look like there?
Well, extraordinary scenes, not just the crowds of staff who've worked with Gordon Brown over the last 10 years. They're giving him the huge cheers and a send-off as he heads off for the palace. But outside, just waiting outside the Treasury, there are crowds, 5 or 6 deep, giving him a big round of applause, shouting their best wishes as Gordon Brown and his wife Sarah head out there to get into the Treasury car. The crowds are cheering. Really a sense of a big occasion here, leaving after a decade, and in just a few minutes from now he'll be there for that audience with the Queen when, as you were saying, he'll be formally invited to form the next government. And after more than a decade of being Prime Minister in waiting, the long, long years of that anticipation are over, and Gordon Brown heading off, looking relaxed, looking smiling as you saw him getting into the car with his wife Sarah there, for the short drive to Buckingham Palace. He's been waiting over an hour, of course, since Prime Minister's question time, occupying himself, clearing up some Treasury papers and getting some briefing for those conversations he's going to be having with other world leaders. That, of course, is going to be one of the first tasks ahead of him this afternoon once he finally does become Prime Minister, along with, as you've just been discussing, forming his new government.
Gordon Brown has left the Treasury and is now driving past St James's Park and the Guards Memorial and Horse Guards Parade, turning onto the Mall. And he now, from the car, will have a bird's eye view of Buckingham Palace, which is where he's heading and where Her Majesty the Queen is waiting for him to offer him the opportunity to form the next government. Nicholas Witchell, our royal correspondent, is there. Nick, this time, a very different kind of audience in prospect.
Yes, though the choreography, Hugh, very much the same. The long wait for Gordon Brown is very nearly over. There he is, making his way up the Mall in this convoy, still in making its way through the traffic, escorted by the police there. A different sort of audience, yes, of course, because this is the audience at which he will be invited to form that government, a much more sober and serious audience than the one that Tony Blair will have had a few minutes ago, on which they will have looked back and perhaps there will have been some sentiment and perhaps even some emotion on Tony Blair's part as he ponders the events of the past 10 years. But now everything passes to this man, the man travelling in the red, I think it's a Vauxhall, which is just coming through as the police outriders stop the traffic as they make their way past the Victoria Memorial, and in a moment they will be coming through the outer gates, the front gates of Buckingham Palace. Quite a good crowd there. We've had a little bit of drizzle this morning, but that's now passed. Overcast and cloudy as Gordon Brown now makes his way across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, and any seconds now we will see his vehicle as he, with his wife, comes into the quadrangle here, and at the King's door people are prepared to meet him and whisk him upstairs to that audience. Tony Blair was in there for very nearly 25 minutes. He left with a private gift from the Queen, but now Gordon Brown emerges, greeted by the Queen's equerry, Commander Heber Ackland, and Lady Susan Hussey, one of the Queen's senior ladies-in-waiting. He introduces Sarah Brown, and they will both go in. Mrs. Brown, of course, as was the case with Cherie Blair, she will wait downstairs while the Queen's private secretary, Sir Robin Janvrin, takes Gordon Brown upstairs to the Queen's audience room, where she will be waiting, and where, as I've said early this morning, there will be no particular ceremony. It's a very low-key meeting, because that is what it is. There is no kneeling or kissing of hands, although that is the expression that is formally used. But in a few moments, Gordon Brown will be invited by the Queen to form a government, and at that moment he becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Nicholas Witchell, thank you very much. So, Gordon Brown, Chancellor for the past decade, now inside Buckingham Palace, making his way up the staircase, where he will be given an audience with the Queen, and where that invitation will be extended. And as Nick was saying, Britain will have a new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who's been in Parliament since 1983, close colleague of Mr. Blair's for all that time, despite their ups and downs, and the handover is taking place as we speak. We're live on BBC One and on News 24 to cover the process of this handover of power between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. While they're in there, let's join John Sopel once again on College Green.
Hugh, thank you very much indeed. Well, here I'm joined by the Health Minister, Andy Burnham, one of those who's been tipped for promotion now that the Brown era is about to start, and by John McTiernan, who has been working in Number 10 with Tony Blair for the past few years. And John McTiernan, I know you were there as Tony Blair left a short time ago. What was it like, the departure?
Well, it was. There's a Number 10 tradition that all the staff line up down the stairs and along the corridor and applaud the Prime Minister on the way out. And we did that, and that was a very moving occasion, because for a lot of us, it's the last time we'll be working in Downing Street, and so it's the end of an era politically, and it was a very moving occasion. There were some people were crying. It was, you know, I had a choke. Everybody was really deeply moved by the moment.
What about the Blairs themselves? How were they?
The Blairs were, as they have been, sort of absolutely confident looking. The whole family were looking fantastic today, and I think that for them, they're going out on a high because they know that politically, what Tony has left now, he's left in his prime. But we've got a new leader for the Labour Party, new Prime Minister, who's absolutely full of all the gifts and talents needs to take on the party. So it's just absolutely perfect.
Did he give any kind of instruction about what degree of emotion or he wanted at the end?
No, he didn't. No, he didn't. He just he wanted to move on, to move out, to put the final touches to his era, and to let Gordon come in good order.
And Andy Burnham, how would you characterise the change that we're now witnessing? We know that Gordon Brown is in there in the palace. How will it be different?
Well, I think, John, we've got to remember this is a really historic day for the British Labour Party, that we're actually seeing this transition of power in this spirit. It is a truly fantastic day for the Labour Party. And what Tony's great legacy is for the Labour Party is that there are, not just me, there's lots of people beneath in the strength in depth, if you like, within the Labour Party who are ready now to take on a new era and build what Tony has left us.
Well, John McTernan, we heard Andy Burnham there talking about it's a great day for the Labour Party. Did you think it would be like this last September?
I don't think anybody in the Labour Party could have been predicted how fantastically the transition's been handled.
That wasn't the question. I said, what did you think it was going to be like last September?
I think I, like everybody in the Labour Party, wanted to see the handover from Gordon Brown, from Tony Blair to Gordon Brown, handled in the best way for the country and for the party. But I think, as Andy said, this has been this has probably been the best 6 weeks for the Labour Party in terms of publicity and our message getting across, our values getting across. And I think that's really what the party wanted at the end of September when we went through party conference.
Yeah, I just wouldn't underestimate the scale of what John's just said, John. I mean, it's a huge achievement. There was a difficult time. There was a time of bitterness where there were some different opinions around, but actually we came through that time. We looked at what was in the right interest of the party, and we've now given ourselves a chance to go forward and really take the country and build on what Tony's achieved. And, you know, we've all put our hearts and souls, haven't we, John, into these last 10 years working with Tony. I look back today to when I was first photocopying his leadership statement the very first day, and John the same. We were involved all the way through. And I think sometimes at home people say, oh, they get emotional on a day like today, but it really truly is, because we put our heart and soul into this work and into this job. And we just today see a Labour legend departing the stage, but our hearts are emotional but glad as well.
OK. Andy Burnham, John McTernan, both of you, thank you very much indeed. Two of the people who've worked very closely with Tony Blair over the years, but looking forward to the Brown era. Hugh, back to you in Downing Street.
John, many thanks. I have to say, it's even darker in the skies now. I'd be amazed if it doesn't rain, but let's hope for Gordon Brown's sake that it doesn't pour when he turns up here in Downing Street. They've just erected a set of microphones, so clearly the time will be right for him to make a big statement when he arrives here. We'll be back on BBC One in a few minutes after we've joined our news teams where you are.
And here on News 24, a summary of today's news. After a decade at number 10, Tony Blair has stepped down as Prime Minister. This afternoon, in front of a packed House of Commons, Tony Blair attended Prime Minister's questions for the last time. He began by paying tribute to Britain's armed forces, saying he was sorry for the difficulties they faced in Afghanistan and Iraq. Our political correspondent Rita Chakrabarti reports on what's been an emotional day for a man who spent 10 years at the top.
There's no privacy in moving out. The Blair family's possessions were carried out one by one for all the world to see as Tony Blair's decade-long tenancy finally comes to an end. For the man who's hours away from being Prime Minister, it was business as usual. Gordon Brown arrived at the Treasury apparently for an ordinary day's work, but it is for him and everyone at Westminster an extraordinary day. This is as near as the public could get to events in Downing Street. The massed ranks of camera crews and photographers had a closer view. He'd been preparing for it since 8 o'clock, and that far from slacking, he threw himself into his work.
Questions?